Hello, everyone, friends. I hope you enjoy listening to and watching this interesting story. There are moments in life when the familiar becomes invisible, when the walls that once promised shelter begin to feel like boundaries, when the rhythm of days, once comforting, becomes a metronome counting down something precious slipping away. For John and Olivia, that moment arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September, as golden light filtered through the kitchen window of the house they had called home for 37 years. John stood at the counter, stirring his coffee in the same circular motion he'd performed countless times before, while Olivia sat at the table with the newspaper spread before her, though her eyes weren't really reading the words. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Everything was exactly as it should be, and yet something felt profoundly wrong. Not broken exactly, but faded, like a photograph left too long in the sun. They had done everything right, raised their children in this house, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical. They had worked hard, saved diligently, and arrived at retirement as planned, like travelers reaching a long-anticipated destination. But now that they were here in this place they'd spent decades moving into ward, they discovered it wasn't a destination at all. It was just another room, and the view from its windows had grown strangely dim. Olivia broke the silence first, though her voice was barely above a whisper. She spoke about a dream she'd had the night before, about walking through a market in a place she didn't recognize, surrounded by colors and sounds she'd never encountered. She spoke about waking up with her heart racing, not from fear, but from something else, something that felt like hunger. John listened, and in her words, he recognized his own restlessness, his own quiet desperation for something he couldn't quite name. That conversation became another, and another. Late into the evenings, they found themselves speaking about the things they'd postponed, the adventures they'd promised themselves someday, the versions of themselves they'd set aside to be responsible, to be practical, to be safe. They spoke about the years ahead and realized with startling clarity that they could count them well. Not infinite anymore, not endless. And that changed everything. The idea arrived not as a lightning bolt, but as a whisper that grew gradually louder. What if they left? What if they sold the house, simplified their lives, and simply went? Not on a vacation with a return date circled on the calendar, but truly went, surrendering to the world's invitation, following the roads wherever they led. The thought was terrifying. It was also intoxicating. Their children, when they told them, reacted with the concern of those who love deeply but cannot quite understand. Questions about healthcare and safety and what would happen if something went wrong tumbled forth. Friends smiled politely, but with the slight bewilderment of people watching someone choose to jump when a perfectly good bridge stood nearby. But John and Olivia had made their decision, and it wasn't made from recklessness. It was made from something deeper. A recognition that the life force within them was still strong, still vibrant, still hungry for experience, and that denying it would be a greater tragedy than any risk they might encounter on the road. The months of preparation were both practical and profound. They sorted through 3 decades of accumulated possessions, holding each object and asking not whether it sparked joy, but whether it was essential to who they wanted to become. Most things they discovered were not. The house sold faster than expected, as if it too was ready for new life, new stories. They purchased a modest vehicle suited for long journeys and equipped it with the essentials, learning to distinguish between what they needed and what they'd simply grown accustomed to having. On the morning of their departure, they stood in the empty house one final time, their footsteps echoing in rooms stripped of furniture and memory. Olivia traced her fingers along the doorframe, where they'd marked their children's heights over the years, those pencil lines like a ladder climbing toward independence. John stood in the bedroom where they'd shared thousands of nights, where they'd whispered hopes and fears, where they'd held each other through grief and joy. They weren't leaving these memories behind, they realized. They were carrying them forward, lightened and distilled to their essence. The first days on the road were disorienting. Without the structure of routine, time felt different, elastic and strange. They drove through landscapes they'd seen in photographs but never experienced with their own senses. The vastness of open country, where the horizon stretched impossibly far and the sky dominated everything. Small towns that appeared suddenly, collections of buildings and lives existing far from the places that typically drew attention. They stopped when they were curious, stayed when they felt welcomed, moved on when restlessness returned. In a coastal town where weathered buildings faced the endless ocean, they spent 3 days simply watching the water. They rose before dawn to see the sun emerge from the sea, and they sat on the shore as it sank back beneath the waves each evening. Olivia remarked that she'd never really looked at the ocean before, not like this. They'd been to beaches certainly, but always with agendas, with schedules, with the weight of everything waiting back home. Now, with nowhere they needed to be, they could actually see it. The way the light changed constantly across the surface. The patterns of the waves never quite the same. The profound indifference of it all, which somehow made their own existence feel both smaller and more precious. They met a fisherman there, a man whose face was carved by wind and sun, who worked from a small boat each morning as his father and grandfather had done before him. He spoke little, but invited them onto his vessel one dawn, and they moved across the water as the world turned from darkness to light. The simplicity of his life, the direct relationship between effort and sustenance, between patience and reward, struck them both. On the return to shore, he gave them several fish, refusing payment. When John asked why, the fisherman simply said that people who understood how to be still on the water were rare, and therefore worth a gift. They learned to navigate by instinct and opportunity rather than fixed plans. A conversation with a woman at a gas station led them to a valley where ancient rock formations rose from the earth like cathedrals built by time itself. They hiked among those towering stones, feeling the weight of geological epochs, the humbling reminder that their personal histories were briefer than a heartbeat in the planet's long dreaming. Yet rather than diminishing them, this perspective liberated them. If their time was so brief, shouldn't they live it fully? Shouldn't they meet it with wonder rather than resignation? In a mountain town where autumn had painted the landscape in impossible colors, they rented a small cabin for a month. The elevation made the air thin and clean, and the silence at night was so complete it almost had texture. They spent mornings hiking trails that wound through forests old and cathedral quiet, where light fell in golden shafts through the canopy, illuminating a world that felt sacred. They spent afternoons reading and writing in journals they'd begun keeping, documenting not just where they went, but who they were becoming in the going. Olivia experienced her own transformation more gradually. She'd spent so much of her life in service to others, not resentfully, but almost unconsciously, as if her own desires were written in a lighter ink that could be erased when needed. On the road, she began to rediscover herself, the woman she'd been before marriage and motherhood, and the woman she was still becoming. She took up painting again, something she'd abandoned 40 years earlier when life grew too busy. Her work was unpracticed and imperfect, but that ceased to matter. She painted the landscapes they encountered, yes, but also her interior terrain. Abstract pieces that captured feeling rather than form. Each one was evidence that she still contained multitudes, that she was not finished growing. They encountered other travelers, some young, and filled with the reckless confidence of those who believe time is infinite, others closer to their own age, carrying different stories but similar hunger. In a desert town built around a natural hot spring, they befriended a couple who'd been traveling for 8 years, moving between continents and cultures with practiced ease. Over dinners shared beneath stars that seemed impossibly bright in the unpolluted darkness, they traded stories and insights. The other couple spoke of how travel had saved their marriage, how the newness of each day had renewed their interest in each other, how adventure proved to be the antidote to the slow drift toward parallel lives. John and Olivia recognized this in their own experience. Without the familiar patterns that had defined their relationship for decades, they were discovering each other again, learning what brought each other joy, what sparked curiosity, what fears still lingered and could now be acknowledged. They argued sometimes, the stress of constant movement and decision-making occasionally fraying patience. But even the conflicts felt different, more honest. Less about old grievances and more about present needs. As seasons changed and their journey continued, they developed a rhythm that felt natural, They'd spend several weeks in motion, covering distance and gathering experiences, then settle somewhere for a month or more, letting themselves put down temporary roots. They volunteered at a community kitchen in a Rust Belt city struggling to reimagine itself, serving meals and hearing stories from people whose lives had taken unexpected turns. They worked a harvest at an organic farm, their bodies aching but satisfied by the physical labor, by the direct connection between work and tangible result. In a southern town known for its music, they stumbled into a small venue on a night when a local band was playing and found themselves dancing for the first time in years. Really dancing, not the self-conscious swaying of wedding receptions, but dancing with abandon, their bodies moving with the rhythm, Olivia's head thrown back in laughter, John's face lit with something that could only be called joy. Strangers joined them, a spontaneous celebration forming, and when the music finally ended, they were breathless and alive in a way that felt utterly new and simultaneously ancient. They crossed borders, navigated language barriers with gestures and laughter, tasted foods they couldn't name, heard music in scales unfamiliar to their Western-trained ears. Each new experience added texture to their understanding of the world and themselves. They witnessed poverty that humbled them and generosity that astonished them. They saw landscapes so beautiful they brought tears, and cities so overwhelming they had to retreat to quiet spaces to process the sensory flood. There were difficult moments, certainly, times when Olivia's arthritis flared and every movement brought pain, and she questioned whether this life was sustainable. Times when John felt the weight of responsibility for their well-being, for keeping them safe in unfamiliar places, and wondered if they'd been foolish. Times when they both felt the pull of the familiar, the temptation to return to what was known and comfortable. In a particularly low moment, stranded by vehicle trouble in a small town where they knew no one, they sat in a modest hotel room and faced the question directly. Should they go back? Acknowledge this as a lovely adventure that had run its course? They talked through the night, not arguing but excavating, getting to the truth beneath the fear and fatigue. And what they found was that despite the challenges, despite the uncertainty, they were more alive now than they'd been in years. The discomfort was real, but it paled beside the deadening numbness they'd escaped. The vehicle was repaired, and they continued. But something had shifted. They'd faced the possibility of returning and chosen to stay on the road, which transformed it from flight into affirmation. They weren't running from their old life anymore. They were running towards something, toward aliveness, toward growth, toward whatever version of themselves was still waiting to emerge. In a northern city where winter arrived early, they spent several months in a small apartment, working part-time jobs that covered expenses and gave structure to their days. John worked in a bookstore, surrounded by stories, recommending titles to customers with the enthusiasm of someone who'd remembered his own love of reading. Olivia taught art classes at a community center, working with teenagers who were themselves searching for identity and voice. They weren't tourists anymore, but temporary residents, participating in community life, making friends, establishing rhythms. And yet, when spring returned and the world began to thaw, they felt the pull of the road again. They'd learned something crucial about themselves. They didn't need to choose between stability and movement, between roots and wandering. They could have both in seasons and cycles. They could settle and then move, put down roots knowing they'd eventually pull them up, make connections, understanding they'd be temporary, but no less real for their impermanence. They returned to places they'd visited before, seeing them with different eyes. The coastal town where they'd met the fisherman, and they sought him out, sharing a meal and catching up on the months between. The mountain cabin where they spent another autumn watching the leaves turn and feeling the world prepare for winter's rest. These returns gave their travels a different quality. They weren't just passing through anymore. They were weaving a web of connections, creating a map defined not by geography but by relationship and memory. On their second year of travel, they did something that surprised even themselves. They began documenting their journey in more formal ways, not for fame or attention, but because they'd encountered so many people their age who looked at them with something like hunger, who said they had always dreamed of doing something similar, but it was too late now. They'd missed their chance. John and Olivia knew this wasn't true. It wasn't too late. Not at 60, not at 70, not at 80, if the health and will remained. And so they wrote about their experiences, shared their mistakes and discoveries, became unexpected advocates for the idea that life's third act could be as adventurous as its first. This unexpected role as inspirations to others added depth to their journey. They began to see themselves not just as individuals pursuing private freedom, but as participants in something larger. A cultural conversation about aging, about what it means to grow older in a society that often treats elders as people whose primary adventures have concluded. They were living proof that this narrative was false, that vitality and curiosity and capacity for growth don't have expiration dates unless we believe they do. In their third year, they made peace with something they'd been avoiding. They contacted their children more regularly, not with guilt or apology, but with honesty about what this journey had given them. And slowly their children began to understand. They saw that their parents weren't abandoning responsibility or indulging in selfishness. They were modeling something vital, the courage to change when change was needed, the wisdom to recognize that a life unlived was a greater tragedy than a life that took risks, the understanding that being good parents didn't mean sacrificing themselves entirely, but rather showing what full living looked like. Their daughter visited them for 2 weeks, joining their travels, and saw firsthand how transformed her parents were. The light in her mother's eyes, the ease in her father's bearing. She returned home with a different understanding, and with her own questions about the life she was building, about whether she too was drifting toward comfortable numbness without realizing it. John and Olivia continued to evolve. They learned to speak 3 new languages with varying degrees of competence, enough to show respect and make connection, if not achieve fluency. They developed skills they'd never imagined needing, from vehicle maintenance to navigating bureaucracy in foreign contexts. They became comfortable with uncertainty in ways that would have terrified their younger selves. Not because they were fearless, but because they'd learned that fear was often worse than the thing feared, and that the worst that could happen was rarely as catastrophic as imagination suggested. They also learned when to rest, how to distinguish between the discomfort of growth and the warning signs of genuine depletion. They built in periods of stillness, understanding that constant movement could become its own form of avoidance. In a retreat center set in rolling hills, they spent a month in silence, meditating and walking and sitting with themselves in ways they'd never done. It was among the most challenging and rewarding experiences of their journey. Coming face to face with their own minds, with the stories they told themselves, with the patterns of thought worn so deep they'd become invisible. When they emerged from that silence, something had clarified. They didn't know how long they'd continue this traveling life, perhaps indefinitely, perhaps for another year or two before settling again in some form. But that uncertainty no longer troubled them. They'd learned to live in the question, to surrender the need to know how the story ended before living the chapters in between. Now, as their 4th year of travel begins, they find themselves in a small village perched on a hillside overlooking a lake so clear and still, it perfectly mirrors the sky. They've rented a cottage here for 6 months, drawn by something ineffable about the place. Maybe they'll stay longer. Maybe they'll leave sooner. The future remains unwritten, and they've grown comfortable with that blank page. They wake each morning as the sun rises over the water, and they walk together down to the shore. Sometimes they talk. Sometimes they're silent, comfortable in the wordless communion of 2 people who've spent decades learning each other. They've discovered that the road they're traveling isn't really about geography at all. It's about presence, about meeting each day with openness, about remaining curious and engaged and alive to possibility. And here's what they've learned, what they'd tell anyone who asked: it's never too late to change. The story you're living isn't the only story available. The person you've become isn't the person you must remain. Life continues to offer invitations right up until the end, and the only real tragedy is refusing to RSVP. They've learned that comfort, while pleasant, is not the same as fulfillment. That safety, while valuable, is not the same as living. That the familiar, while comforting, can become a prison if we're not careful. They've learned that they're braver than they knew, more capable than they'd believed, more alive than they'd dared to hope. As evening falls over the lake, they sit on their cottage porch, watching the light change and the first stars emerge. Tomorrow they might drive to the town on the other side of the lake they've heard about. Or they might spend the day right here, doing nothing of consequence, being still and present and grateful. The choice is theirs, as it is every day, and that freedom, that radical autonomy, is perhaps the greatest gift they have given themselves. John reaches over and takes Olivia's hand, and she squeezes back, and no words are needed because they both understand. This journey, which began as escape from numbness, has become a return to themselves. The road, which seemed to lead away from home, has somehow brought them to the truest home they have ever known. Not a place, but a way of being. Not a destination, but a practice of attention and openness and courage. And so they continue, these two souls, who decided that 60 was not an ending, but an invitation. That retirement was not a withdrawal from life, but a gateway to living more fully. They continue down roads known and unknown, through landscapes external and internal, hand in hand, hearts open, grateful for each moment, alive. I'd love to hear your story. Feel free to share it in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and motivates me to create even more great content.